The first body was discovered on a crisp December morning, the chill of the Pacific Northwest biting through the air. Officer Carrie Langston stood in the damp alley, her breath clouding as she stared at the grotesque structure before her. The smell of gingerbread, sweet, spiced, and cloying, clashed with the grim scene. The house stood nearly 6 feet tall, its walls elaborately decorated with icing snowflakes and gumdrop shingles. But it was what lay inside that turned Carrie's stomach. The victim, a well-known food blogger, was encased within the sugary walls, their lifeless face eerily replicated in marzipan above the doorway. I don't even know what to call this, murmured Detective Ethan Morales as he joined her. His usual sharp wit was subdued, replaced by a grim expression. He crouched to examine the scene, careful not to disturb the delicate yet horrifying structure. It's like something out of a nightmare. Or a twisted fairy tale, Carrie replied, her voice low. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the intricate details. Whoever had done this wasn't just a killer, they were an artist, a deeply deranged one. The victim was identified as Robin Keller, a notoriously scathing critic in Portland's food scene. Keller had built a reputation for tearing down chefs and bakers with biting reviews, often leaving careers in ruins. Now, it seemed, someone had decided to return the favor. Word spread quickly, and the city's culinary community was gripped with a mix of fear and disbelief. Portland prided itself on its food culture, a mecca for gourmands and artisans alike. But the grisly display was a stark reminder that even the sweetest facades could hide something bitter. By the afternoon, news outlets were buzzing with headlines like, "Gingerbread Murder, Portland's Dark Holiday Mystery." Speculation ran rampant. Was it a disgruntled chef, a crazed fan of Keller's work, or someone with a more personal vendetta? Carrie and Ethan found themselves buried in leads, each one more absurd than the last. A rival blogger pointed fingers at a rising pastry chef who had recently been the subject of Keller's harshest critique. A restaurateur claimed the work bore the signature style of a rogue cake decorator she'd fired months ago. But none of it added up. The level of craftsmanship, the meticulous planning, it suggested someone with more than just a passing knowledge of baking. This was someone who lived and breathed it. Ethan sifted through Keller's last few reviews, hoping for a clue. "Listen to this," he said, reading aloud. "The gingerbread lacked depth, its texture reminiscent of cardboard rather than the comforting snap of a proper bake. A disaster, through and through." He set the paper down with a grimace. "I'd be angry too." Carrie raised an eyebrow. "Angry enough to bake someone into a house? You'd be surprised," Ethan muttered. "People take food seriously around here." Their break came 3 days later, when another body was found. This time, it was a TV host who had built a career on dramatic, over-the-top critiques of local eateries. He was discovered in the middle of Pioneer Courthouse Square, encased in an even larger gingerbread monstrosity. The scene drew a crowd, despite the grisly nature of the crime. Whispers spread through the onlookers. Was this the work of a serial killer? The holidays, once a time of joy and indulgence, now carried an undercurrent of fear. The new victim's marzipan likeness was no less chilling than the first. A wreath of spun sugar encircled the figure, and candy canes jutted from the corners of the house like sinister sentinels. The detail was staggering. The killer wasn't just making a statement, they were putting on a show. "This is about more than revenge," Carrie said as they examined the scene. "This is theatrical. They're sending a message." "But what message?" Ethan asked, frustration coloring his tone. "That food critics should watch their backs? That bad reviews are a death sentence?" Carrie didn't answer. She was staring at the house, her mind racing. The precision, the artistry, it reminded her of something. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but it nagged at her like an itch she couldn't scratch. Back at the station, they pored over lists of suspects. Chefs Keller had angered, bakers the TV host had humiliated, even culinary students with grudges to bear. One name kept resurfacing, a former baker named Margot Ellison, whose bakery had shuttered after a string of scathing reviews. Margot had vanished from the public eye after the closure, but whispers in the industry suggested she hadn't taken the downfall well. Some said she'd sworn revenge, others claimed she'd simply disappeared. Ethan frowned as he read Margot's file. Her bakery was famous for its gingerbread. People called her the best in the city before things went south. And now 2 critics who helped ruin her career are dead, encased in gingerbread houses, Carrie said, her tone heavy. That's more than a coincidence. But finding Margot proved to be easier said than done. She'd left no trace, no forwarding address, no online presence. It was as if she'd evaporated, leaving only the faintest crumbs of her former life. Carrie couldn't shake the feeling that Margot was watching them, silently savoring the chaos she'd unleashed. Whoever the killer was, they weren't done yet. As the city braced itself for the holidays, a shadow hung over Portland's festive streets. Gingerbread, once a symbol of warmth and joy, had become a harbinger of death. And somewhere in the midst of the holiday cheer, the killer was preparing their next masterpiece. Portland buzzed with unease as the holidays crept closer. Bakeries hesitated to display their signature gingerbread houses, and restaurants saw a sharp decline in reservations. The killer had turned a cherished tradition into a nightmare. Carrie Langston and Ethan Morales worked tirelessly, chasing leads that only seemed to circle back to Margot Ellison. The former baker had vanished after her career imploded, leaving a void filled with whispers and suspicion. Yet no solid evidence tied her to the crimes. "We're missing something," Carrie muttered, staring at the evidence board. The grotesque gingerbread houses dominated, alongside profiles of the victims. Each house gnawed at her thoughts, their artistry both brilliant and horrifying. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaustion evident. "What's the killer saying with these houses, beyond revenge?" "They're personal," Carrie replied. "Each house mocks the victim's critiques, turning their words into something sugary and hollow." It was a theory that fit. Keller's review had called Margot's gingerbread ornate but lifeless. His house had been exactly that, stunning but empty. The TV host's garish gingerbread reflected his flamboyant persona. This killer didn't just strike, they made a point. "Margot was meticulous," Ethan said, flipping through old articles. "If this is her, she's still baking her story." A call interrupted their analysis. Another house had been found, this time in a secluded park. The victim was a rising star in Portland's food writing scene, encased in a towering gingerbread structure. The house was even more elaborate than the others. Spun sugar wreaths framed the door, while the victim's marzipan likeness perched grotesquely on the roof, holding a fondant quill. It was as if the killer was growing more confident, perfecting their craft. Carrie's voice was grim as she examined the scene. "It's like they're inviting an audience." Ethan nodded. "They're escalating. They want to be seen." The victim's last article had lambasted Portland's baking scene, calling it overly nostalgic and uninspired. The house's old-fashioned design seemed a pointed response, a mocking rebuttal. Back at the station, they mapped connections between the victims. All had crossed paths with Margot, through reviews, appearances, or public events. Yet Margot remained a ghost. "She's been off the grid for years," Ethan said. "No credit cards, no known associates. If this is her, she planned every detail." Carrie studied a photo of Margot from her bakery's prime. She was famous for her gingerbread. If she's behind this, she's leaving crumbs of herself in every scene. The next morning, a package arrived at the precinct, addressed to Carrie and Ethan. Inside was a gingerbread cookie shaped like a detective's badge, its icing unnervingly precise. Ethan unfolded the note tucked beneath it. "The critics are done. Now it's your turn to judge." Carrie's stomach turned as she examined the cookie. The killer wasn't just taunting them, they were challenging them. The cookie's emblem bore her precinct number, a chilling reminder of how close the killer was. "They're escalating," Carrie said. "This is personal now." The handwriting on the note was elegant and deliberate, much like the killer's work. Forensics confirmed the cookie matched materials from the crime scenes, further tying it to Margot's signature style. Where are they baking this? Carrie wondered. These houses need space, tools, ovens. They're operating on an industrial scale. Ethan pulled up a map of abandoned commercial spaces in Portland. If it's Margot, she'd need privacy and equipment, maybe a closed bakery? The search led them to a shuttered pastry shop on the city's outskirts. Carrie caught the faint scent of gingerbread as she approached. Her hand hovered near her holster as she radioed for backup and pushed the door open. Inside, the air was thick with the aroma of spices. Gleaming tools lined the counters, trays of freshly baked gingerbread sat cooling, and a partially built gingerbread house stood in the center of the room. Carrie froze. The house, though unfinished, was a chilling replica of the precinct building. Her pulse quickened as she scanned the room. The killer wasn't just taunting them, they were planning their next target. The scent of gingerbread lingered in the air as Carrie Langston stood inside the abandoned bakery. The partially built house loomed in the center of the room, its walls lined with pristine icing, its design unmistakable, a replica of their precinct. Ethan Morales entered cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the dim interior. "It's like they wanted us to find this," he murmured, eyes scanning the trays of gingerbread, piping bags, and mixing bowls. "This wasn't rushed, they're taking their time." Carrie's gaze locked on the unfinished structure. "They're sending a message. They've been one step ahead, but this feels deliberate, like a breadcrumb trail." Forensics swept the bakery, uncovering fingerprints on the tools and counters. They were faint, but enough to run through the system. Carrie and Ethan waited in tense silence as the lab processed the results, each passing minute thick with dread. The answer came faster than they expected, a match to Margot Ellison. "That's it," Ethan said, slamming his palm on the desk. "We've got her. She's tied to the scene." "Legally, yes," Carrie replied, "but this doesn't feel over. If Margot wanted to disappear, she wouldn't have left prints." She stared at the evidence board, her instincts screaming that the killer wasn't done yet. As the city braced for another blow, a new pattern emerged. Social media lit up with anonymous messages targeting Portland's food community. Posts mocked critics and chefs alike, calling out their failures, their flaws, their hypocrisies. "They're baiting us," Carrie said, scrolling through the posts. "But why go public now? Why stir the pot?" "It's psychological," Ethan said. "They're feeding off the chaos. Look at the comments. People are eating it up. This isn't just revenge anymore. It's a performance." The killer's reach widened when a local morning show received a package containing a gingerbread house the size of a shoebox. It was perfect in detail, complete with a tiny marzipan figure lying face down on the roof. The host, shaken but unharmed, called the police immediately. The marzipan figure bore a striking resemblance to another prominent food critic. Hours later, that critic's body was found, this time encased in a house placed in the window of a popular downtown bakery. The city spiraled into panic. Restaurants and bakeries began closing early, chefs canceled public appearances, and food critics went silent. Fear gripped Portland's culinary scene. "This is it," Ethan said, pacing the station. "They're pushing us toward the finale. Every move is bigger, more theatrical." Carrie nodded, her mind racing. "They're escalating quickly. We have to stop them before the next act." Tracking Margot became their singular focus. Financial records were dry, but a deep dive into city permits revealed something curious. Margot had rented a small industrial space under a shell company months before the killings began. "That's our kitchen," Ethan said, grabbing his coat. The building was nestled in a quiet industrial park. Carrie and Ethan approached cautiously, back up a block away. The scent of spices wafted from the building, faint but unmistakable. Inside, the room was immaculate, the tools gleaming under fluorescent lights. On the far wall, a dozen gingerbread houses sat on display, each one labeled with the name of a victim. But two houses stood out. They were unfinished, their labels blank. Carrie's breath hitched. "These are next." Ethan moved to inspect the scene, but a sharp clatter froze them both. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward, apron dusted with flour, hands gloved. "Margot Ellison," Carrie said, her voice steady. "It's over." Margot tilted her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Over, Detective, it's only just begun." Ethan reached for his radio, but Margot held up a hand. "Don't bother, you've already lost the element of surprise." "You've gone too far," Carrie said. "The city's in chaos. You think this will end well for you?" Margot's smile widened. "End? Oh no, this isn't the end. This is art, Detective. Every masterpiece deserves a climax." Carrie took a step forward. "We can stop this. Whatever you're planning, it doesn't have to go further." Margot's eyes darkened. "You don't understand. They ruined me, turned my life's work into a joke, but now I've turned the joke into a legacy." The tension snapped as backup swarmed the building. Margot bolted for the back exit, weaving through shelves and trays. Carrie and Ethan gave chase, their footsteps echoing through the industrial hallways. Carrie tackled Margot just as she reached the door, pinning her to the ground. Margot struggled, her face twisting in rage. "You'll never stop it," Margot hissed. "The recipe's already been written." As Margot was hauled away, Carrie and Ethan surveyed the scene. The killer was in custody, but the city's scars ran deep. The gingerbread houses, the victims, the fear. It would haunt Portland long after the holidays ended. Carrie turned to Ethan. "We caught her, but something tells me this isn't over." Ethan nodded, staring at the rows of gingerbread houses. "Not until we know what she meant by that recipe." The aftermath of Margot Ellison's arrest left the city reeling. Portland's culinary community began to breathe again, but unease lingered. Margot refused to cooperate, her only words to the detectives a cryptic refrain. "The recipe is already written." Carrie Langston and Ethan Morales pored over the evidence recovered from Margot's hideout. The gingerbread houses, the tools, the handwritten notes, all spoke to an obsessive precision. But something didn't sit right with Carrie. The killings felt too complex, too layered for a single person to execute alone. "She didn't do this alone," Carrie said, flipping through Margot's notebooks. "She's the face of it, sure, but the method, the sheer scale, there's more to this." Ethan looked up from his laptop. "I've been digging into Margot's past. She had an assistant during her bakery days, a culinary prodigy named Luke Price. He vanished around the same time Margot's business collapsed." Carrie's pulse quickened. What if Margot isn't the mastermind? What if she's just the baker? Their theory solidified when forensic analysis of Margot's prints came back. While her fingerprints were on some tools, others bore a second, unidentified set. The accomplice theory wasn't just plausible, it was likely. A breakthrough came late one night when an anonymous tip led them to a secluded farmhouse on the outskirts of the city. The caller claimed the property had been used recently, with deliveries of industrial baking supplies arriving weekly. The farmhouse was eerily quiet as the team approached. The scent of nutmeg and cinnamon hung in the cold air, mingling with the rustle of trees. Carrie's heart pounded as she pushed open the door, revealing a sprawling kitchen, its counters lined with trays of cooling gingerbread. In the center of the room stood a massive gingerbread house, larger and more elaborate than any they'd seen. It depicted the city of Portland, complete with intricate sugar models of its landmarks. And there near the edge were two small marzipan figures, perfect replicas of Carrie and Ethan. Ethan pointed to the back of the room where a figure worked methodically at a counter. The man turned slowly, his face calm but his eyes alight with an unsettling focus. "Luke Price?" Carrie asked, her voice firm. The man smiled faintly. "Detectives, you're just in time for the final course." Carrie drew her weapon. "Step away from the counter, it's over." Luke raised his hands, the smile never wavering. "You think Margot was the villain in this story? She was just an ingredient. I baked the masterpiece." Ethan frowned. "Why? Why go to such extremes? What's this really about?" Luke's expression shifted, his calm exterior cracking. "Do you know what it's like to be invisible? To create something beautiful, only to watch someone else take the credit?" His voice grew sharper. "I was the talent. Margot was the face. Every recipe, every idea mine. And when she fell, I fell with her, forgotten, erased." Carrie tightened her grip on her weapon. "So this is revenge? Killing critics because they didn't praise you?" Luke shook his head. "Not revenge. A correction. These people, critics, chefs, tastemakers, they don't create. They destroy. They ruined Margot, and they nearly destroyed me. But now I've turned their words into art. They'll never be forgotten." Ethan stepped forward cautiously. "And the houses? Why the houses?" Luke smiled again, his tone almost wistful. "A gingerbread house is a symbol. Warmth, home, nostalgia. But I've turned it into something else. A tomb for their arrogance. They thought they could shape the culinary world. Now they're part of mine." Before Carrie could respond, Luke grabbed a piping bag filled with molten sugar, flinging it toward them. The detectives ducked as the sugar splattered against the wall, steaming and hissing. Luke bolted toward the back door. Carrie and Ethan gave chase, their footsteps echoing through the narrow hallways of the farmhouse. Luke was fast, but desperation fueled the detectives. Carrie tackled him just as he reached the woods, pinning him to the ground. As they hauled Luke back to the house, his calm demeanor returned. "You've stopped me," he said, "but my masterpiece is complete. The gingerbread city, it's my legacy. People will talk about this forever. Carrie stared at him, her voice cold. Your legacy is pain, nothing more. With Luke in custody and Margot's role as an accomplice confirmed, the case finally came to an end. But the scars on Portland's culinary scene ran deep. Restaurants reopened cautiously, critics returned with hesitation, and gingerbread houses became symbols of a holiday season darkened by fear. As Carrie packed up the evidence one last time, she glanced at Ethan. "Do you think he was right? That people will remember this?" Ethan sighed. "People remember tragedy, but they'll also remember who stopped it." Carrie nodded, but the sweetness of victory was tainted by bitterness. The baker's twisted masterpiece might fade, but its shadow would linger. If your sweet tooth was satiated with this tale, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell. Another American Killscape is upon us.